The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everybody and good afternoon to this International Pig Club from Mexico. For those who don't know me, I'm Andrew Palmer. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Relationship Manager for HDB Pork. Just to go over with a bit of housekeeping to start with, all the attendees will be muted. Event timings, we are aiming to finish at 4 p.m. Although if the questions just run over a little bit, we'll just we'll keep going with the flow. The webinar will be recorded and made available after the event. And please do find time at the end to complete the survey, which will help us improve our webinars in the future. Just a little bit about how to ask a question on this GoToWebinar platform. If you see on the corner of your screen on the right hand side, there'll be an orange arrow. Depending if it's pointing in or out. If it's pointing out, you'll see there is a display area in the corner, and you'll see the questions tab. If you just tick the little arrow at what says questions, it'll open that box, and then you'll see where to ask your questions in, and then just press send. We'll monitor the questions throughout the webinar, but we'll save the questions till the end of the webinar, unless there's something burning comes through the presentation, of which I'll ask Gonzalo the question that comes up. Just a short introduction to Gonzalo, because I know he's got a slide introducing himself a little bit more than I can possibly read out. But Gonzalo is the Business Unit Director for Pig and Poultry for Zoetis. He spent a lot of time, including his education in Mexico and South Americas, including the USA. And now he resides in the UK with his family. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gonzalo. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me well still?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the introductions, Andrew, and thank you everyone for joining us, and for everyone that will join us later to see the recording. I think you're going to find the topic quite interesting, because it is a really interesting opportunity to be absolutely honest, as I sit here knowing a little bit more about the UK's production and the opportunity that is in Mexico. But let me start by sharing a few things. And Andrew or someone, can you just confirm that you can still see my screen?
Can't see your screen yet, Gonzalo. I can see your good self.
Can't see. Okay, let me
sorry to interrupt. I can see it on my end currently, so it should hope.
Right. Great. Change presenter. No. Application. Yeah, here we go. So you should. Okay, let's try this once more. Can you see the screen now?
I can still see it on my.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll carry on. So what I'm going to present to you all is just a small introduction about me, just to give you context. I'll talk about Mexico in general, numbers, so that you get a sense for things, the country, the size, production, consumption, imports, exports, so on. I'll talk about issues impacting the industry while doing first a little bit of an introduction to some of the key metrics in the industry. And then finally, I'll go into some other organizations, universities, and government programs that might be of interest to you. I think the organizations in particular might be of interest as you look at discussing with them, reaching out, or understanding a little bit more. This is obviously meant to be a very brief introduction. You can never really give any good country its due in 45 minutes. So I'll give it my best, but I hope you enjoy it, and feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions. So who am I? I've been around the world. I actually was born and raised in Mexico. Then I have a little map here. I actually moved to North Carolina, where I did an MBA. And then from there, I moved to Washington, D.C., which is just north of North Carolina. I worked as a consultant for a strategy firm for 6 years, and then moved with that strategy firm to Chicago before eventually working with Pfizer on the divestiture of Zoetis, and then stayed with Zoetis. I really like the people, the industry, and have been there, or have been with Zoetis for 10 years, and moved to the UK, all the way from Mexico to the UK, so quite a big jump in 2021. Let me get a spotlight just so that you can maybe follow me there. My experience with Pork is that with Zoetis, I started first in what we call commercial operations, which are all of the support functions for sales, customer service, business intelligence, workforce effectiveness, and so on. And then moved to become the swine BU lead for Mexico. And then as of December of 2020, I was become the pig and poultry business unit director. So what do I mean by business unit director? I basically manage the sales, marketing, and technical teams. I look at the P&L, focus on what do we need to focus in order to invest so that we increase our presence in the market, and provide strategic guidance for my team, and actually feedback to our global team in terms of opportunities for the company here. So having said that, it won't pass. There we go. So let me talk a little bit about Mexico in numbers. Let me introduce you with these beautiful, my beautiful country, and maybe not a little too fast. So first, let me start by saying Mexico is a huge country. Territory-wise, you could fit 21 European countries within the territory of Mexico. As you can see, the UK is right here, and you can also fit Germany, some of the other larger countries, maybe not all of the large countries, but it is quite large and quite dispersed, with significantly different climates, weathers, and conditions, from the very hot and dry north to medium temperature in the middle, to a very actually jungly type in the south. So very warm as well in the south, but in a very different way, and extremely dense jungles. And I've actually got a couple of pictures of farms down there, so that'll give you a little bit of a sense. It's not just very large in terms of territory. Mexico is also very large in terms of people. So we've got roughly 130 million people, 10th largest population in the world, actually getting quite close to Russia, and particularly based on the fact that it's still growing. So it's not obviously most aggressive growth compared to some of the other South Asian countries, but it is, growing much better than many other countries. And that obviously allows for it to have better demographics. And then economy-wise, $1.7 trillion, so about just roughly half of the UK. So that also provides a little bit of context. So the UK has about half the population, with about twice the economy, so 4 times as much GDP per person, and therefore a significant greater amount of development. But it is still a pretty significant country, and it would be larger than many or most of the European counterparts. Now, in terms of pork consumption, Mexico is actually the 8th largest pork consumer in the world. It is actually a pretty important protein, particularly, it has actually become a particularly important protein due to its good price to value ratio. Obviously, we know that the largest ones being China, the EU, the US, and so on. But what's going to be interesting for you is look at this number: 2.5 million tons of pig consumed per year versus 1.5 million produced. So that's a pretty significant difference. So it's about 1 million tons, a little bit over 1 million tons of pork that are consumed that are not produced in Mexico. Even though Mexico is the 8th largest producer, it has a significant deficit in terms of its production to its potential. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, let me also give you a little bit of context of where it's produced, because that's actually going to answer, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, some of the questions that you might have as to why the production numbers are what they are. So just to give you context, the #1 producer, Jalisco, is actually the largest by a significant margin. But the #2 producing state, Sonora, as I said, is in the very dry northwest. And the #4, 8, and 9 are in the very, very warm south. So what you've got is a lot of production in very extreme heat and climate. So if you think about the temperatures that we experienced a couple of weeks ago and how much stress the pigs were under when we hit that 40 degrees, that's actually quite common, obviously, up here and in the Yucatan Peninsula. And the Yucatan Peninsula has one of the biggest producers in Mexico by a significant margin, which gives a little bit of a better opportunity for the ones here in the center, which have slightly more temperate. And I say slightly because obviously it's nothing like what we have here. Mexico's production has actually been increasing as of the last couple of years, and it's recovering from some health issues in the last in 2021 and 22. But it's consistently been growing, again, driven by the fact that the local demand is there, and I mean, production is cheap, but not as cheap as in some of the other places. So here, that really leads us to trade. Mexico does export, and it's actually a pretty significant exporter. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's about the 7th or 8th largest exporter. But it mainly exports very high quality, very specialized products to Japan, and a little bit to the US and China when the opportunity came up. What's interesting is, as I said, the trade balance, as you can see, is about negative 1 million tons, which is massive. And that is pretty much all coming from the US. I mean, while 4 countries represent 99.96% of all Mexican imports, pretty much all of it comes from the US, as you can see. And what's even more interesting is what is it that Mexicans import. And most of it, I mean, goes into this bigger, broader category of legs, shoulders, and pieces boned in, fresh or frozen. But mainly, if you ask traders, it's actually the hams, the legs and hams that are brought in from the US, which can produce at almost dumping rates. They can produce at really, really low rates to a point that is now hurting, and they are losing money or have been losing money over the last about year. It's been a really, really tough time for the Americans in this time, and we're really only buying very specific pieces of pig meat from them. So now that we've spoken a little bit about what the flows and production are and the size of Mexico, let me talk a little bit about the production itself. So obviously, as you would have here, you've got technified, semi-technified, and traditional or backyard production. And if you see, I mean, most of it is technified, some small amount semi-technified, and then still a significant portion is traditional or backyard. I would say actually more traditional than backyard or backyard in the sense of really small farms, 5 or less sows, really looking to feed a family or a small group of people living in rural areas. Whereas what you see is that pretty much the technified has forced that unless you're really technified and can be efficient in your production systems, you're gonna have a tough time, and therefore you're either really big or really small. In terms of production parameters, I mean, you'll see a quite interesting gap from the average in Mexico to the top 10, and going from the births per year, 2.1, 2.5, born alive about 13 to almost 15 per lot, per batch, and that's a pretty significant difference from the average to the top 10 precisely because of the good production that the top 10 would have, and the fact that you do have a lot of small producers here. Mortality pre-wean is actually quite significant, and that's actually probably a big topic that we face due to the extreme conditions. Average daily gain in kilograms per day, actually, I would say seems very similar to what I've seen here, and feed conversion rates. But probably one of the biggest differences you'll see the market weights, where the average is close to 120 kilograms, and the top 10 are producing near 130. They're really pushing, and if anything I could say is that they're really pushing for 130 or more to be the average for the top producers. There is a lot of value that they believe that there is in that sense, and not just the weights, but also the time it takes to get there. They're really pushing on getting much faster, much better, to the point of going from wind per year of 25 to 31. And then probably one of the biggest differences here in the wind per sow per year is really due to the fact that there are some small regions in Mexico that are PIRS free. So they really try to make a focus of maintaining themselves that way. I'm actually going to come back to the map because I think it is quite relevant. So the Yucatan Peninsula in particular, and some of the Chiapas region, so the south, have been able to cut themselves off from pretty much the rest of Mexico and keep their health status much higher, which has allowed for them to have much better production parameters, particularly as vis-a-vis PIRS and pigs wind per sow. So talking a little bit more about the typical production system, I mean, you've got, honestly, I mean, a lot of variability with the production, 50 sows, but that's really, I would say, takes a lot of the traditional backyard that we spoke about. And then all of the newer houses, all of the growth is really coming from much bigger housing arrangements. Wind at roughly 21 days, they really are not interested in this whole 4 and 5 week winning idea. They've tended to and pushed for very, very short wind time frames. Farming crates and stalls are actually quite standard there. There is no regulation in that sense. And I would actually, I mean, I know as a matter of fact that animal welfare is not quite there in Mexican consumers' consciousness. Why? Mainly due to cost. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to remember that the standard or GDP per person in the UK is about 4 times that of Mexico or more, and therefore, I mean, people are much more concerned about how far they can stretch their dollars. Also, another big one is that Mexico is a castration market, full castration market, but it is moving strongly to improvac or immunocastration to delay castration and get more value out of the entire nature of the boars for a significant longer period of time, while gaining some of the benefits of the barrows of similar to castration, to get the intramuscular fat and the better taste that has been liked by particularly the export markets. Wind to finish systems are very common, so usually sows, nurseries, and then going into wind to finish systems, very much like they are starting to do here. Rather than having sites 2 and sites 3 separate, they tend to have them all together. But contrary to what I've seen here, where I still see, or I've seen a lot of really good, nice straw systems, over there it's really mostly slatted systems without, again, the really big focus has been on getting to as big set of pigs as possible. But really, it's on the consolidation of the industry. So if I look at the industry, most of it is indoors, as I said. I mean, even the small backyard is still pretty much all of it indoors. But it's really the large players who are fully integrated vertically that have more than 50,000 sows, and we've got 5 producers that are at that level, and there's at least another 2 that are shooting to get there in the short term, and there's at least 3 producers that are in the 80 to 100,000 sow level. So these are pretty significant systems that have developed over there. And just to get you a sense of the size of the industry, we're talking about 1.4 million sows in production in Mexico. And then of that 1.4 million, about 40% of it is owned by integrators. I mean, again, these processing plants who are fully integrated and who will work with other third-party producers, as we do here, in order to get the finishing to be completed there. And of those 5 really, really large producers. All of them have their own processing facilities except one. And they have feed mills and genetic nuclei and all of that in order to process pretty much from start to finish. I mean, they are really fully integrated. And most of the growth in this industry has come from, let's say, not just that top 5, but let's say that top 10 to 20, in detriment of the really middle and some of the smaller producers. So if they're really small and just feeding their family, I mean, obviously that's not going to be an issue. But for the medium guys, there's really a very tough situation to compete with, as we do face here. But with as large as systems as they've developed over there, and the one that I'm showing here is from Smithfields, whose one of its local subsidiaries, Granjas Carroll, is a really impressive new, I mean, they opened this back in 2018, if I remember correctly, processing plant that's just massive. I think they can process over 1 million pigs per year. And then one of the other pieces that I wanted to show was precisely on that Yucatan Peninsula, how they've built these massive, I mean, really, really large buildings that can house 4,000 or 5,000 pigs, and they're in the middle of nowhere, so they can significantly manage their situation in terms of biosecurity. And that's actually a pretty important element that has allowed some of these larger systems in Mexico to be much better in terms of their production parameters. I am not going to stop. I know that they're taking questions that we're going to take to the end, but I mean, some of these are, I mean, happy to discuss. Some of these are really amazing systems. So now, if we talk about their health concerns, there's 2 main diseases that, I mean, have really, I mean, made a significant impact, and they are really worried about and working quite hard to remain CSF and ASF free. So PEDV, porcine endemic diarrhea virus, is probably the biggest, or has been, or was one of the biggest challenges. Came out of nowhere back in about 2013, 14. Really high mortality rates, about 70% in the first times the batches were hit. And now it's come to see still, I mean, anywhere from 10 to 20% mortalities, which is still pretty amazing. I mean, it's just a really, really bad numbers. Now, there are 2 vaccines, one MSDs and one is Zoetis, but they only transfer some maternal immunity through colostrum. That's not quite what you've come to expect from vaccines, but it does allow for stability in the systems. But that's a pretty significant issue affecting mostly central and west parts of Mexico. Whereas Pierce, and the fact that we have the American strain of Pierce, which is really aggressive, significantly more aggressive than what we have here, it really unstable. It makes for a very unstable system, significant losses due to immunosuppression. Of course, much more mummies, you know, impact in how many pigs are born alive, and that is a statistic that I didn't have, but it's got a pretty significant impact. And the fact that it continues to mutate and that we see significant changes there. There's a new strain that's been wreaking havoc in the US, and that they're quite worried about it in Mexico. And quite a few states are actually investing in joint plans to stabilize and eventually hoping to get to eradication, but they're not quite there yet. I mean, stabilizing is really, and as an example, largest producer, they basically made vaccination a requirement. They are forcing everybody to come to a certain minimum set of standards for piglets to then be allowed for transport. And then, as I said, there are a few states such as the Yucatan Peninsula, which are Pierce-free, and obviously that has a huge positive impact in their production numbers. As I've said, Mexico is classical swine fever free. It has been since 2012, with official recognition from the US since 2017. And one of the biggest pieces is that they maintain a CSF vaccine just in order to be able to react as fast as possible if required. But they also continue to invest in significant border controls in order to mitigate the risks from classical swine fever. And that actually has led to the controls and the plans that they've been working on in terms of African swine fever. That's, of course, another significant concern that we all share. And in that sense, the US, Canada, and Mexico hold yearly cross-border talks and planning sessions, and even have run simulations to see how they would respond to an ASF outbreak, trying to make sure that they could contain it, stamp it down, and really make sure that it doesn't create the type of negative impact that it has had, definitely in the rest of Europe. And obviously, we're starting to see some of those in Italy being quite concerning. I also wanted to bring up a topic which I thought was going to be of particular interest to all of you in terms of labor. I know labor is a significant concern here, but it's not just a concern here, it is a global concern, I would say. And even though Mexico has 130 million people, and you might think it's less developed, people wouldn't contest to working in the farm. What you have to think about is that while we've had all of these growth, the growth rate has actually quite stabilized and come significantly down. And as you saw, if we were to take this graph from 2015 out to 2023, the growth rate would continue to have come down to about 0.75%. So that's actually a significant decrease. But also, an interesting and relevant correlation to this has been the significant increase in urbanization. I mean, people have moved away from the rural areas in the mid-1950s to the urban areas. And not just that, Mexico has become a significant manufacturing powerhouse, supporting the US and Canadian industries. And what that has meant is that if people have the option of working in a climate-controlled manufacturing site, be it a car manufacturer or anything else, or TVs or anything like that, versus working in the fields, many a times they will choose, obviously, that type of activity. And even though we do have 3 million people still working in agricultural activities, that has actually almost halved from where it was at 20 years ago, which very much goes to this correlation of the level of urbanization versus the rural living conditions. So that really has meant that, in general, people or companies have had a tougher time than they've been used to dealing with in terms of finding the right farm hands, keeping them, training them, and having those farm hands really help in production. Finally, let's talk a little bit about NGOs, so the non-governmental organizations, universities, and the government itself. So in terms of organizations, OPORMEX is a single equivalent to the NPA, which stands for Organización de Porcicultores de México, Mexican organization of porciculture, so pork producers. And I think the interesting part is that there were actually 2 organizations up until about 2018. And in 2019, they finally merged and became a single organization. And it's actually done quite well. This organization is the one that does most of the trade support, actually, quite interestingly, because there is no AHDB-like organization that has levies and that supports the development of the producers. There are good practice certification organizations like AXA, which is the main one, which is actually tied closely with this OPORMEX, but it is neither public, as in it does not provide a seal that is then used in the way that Red Tractor is here. So most producers will actually leverage different types of stickers in their, or labels in their packaging, to provide context for consumers. Now, that doesn't mean that consumers don't look for certain characteristics. It's just that most of the market is still quite general. I mean, about 1/3 of all production is still actually sold on carcass and traded to other producers who have the end consumer focused brands. So it's quite a different market in that sense. University wise, there are universities particularly in the top 5. I mean, there's universities in all of the top states, top 10 producing states, but I would say the top 5 are all extremely well recognized and support and produce significant number of vets that have gone there. Now, there is the National University, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, so that's the letters in Spanish. It is the top university in Spanish-speaking Latin America, so it's actually considered one of the best universities for not just veterinary school. It is a great veterinary school university, but it is considered one of the best universities. It's massive. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's something like 60 or 70,000 people are enrolled in this university at any given time, maybe even more. So it is a pretty significant, pretty large university system because it actually has many campuses. But the main campus and where the veterinary faculty is in Mexico City. Beautiful campus. If you're ever in Mexico, I would strongly recommend that you visit. And curiously enough, Zoetis does have a lab, and I remember when I was back there in 2018, took a couple of pictures of the lab technicians that we have in shared, running sharedly with the UNAM, where we particularly support sequencing and research around SIV, swine influenza virus, PCV, and most recently with a significant focus on PIRS based on obviously the challenges that PIRS has provided to the industry. It is, I mean, it has been a very interesting partnership with that university. And then in terms of government, the main government organization, the equivalent of DEFRA, would be SAGARPA, which is the Agriculture, Livestock and Rural Development Fishing Secretariat. And these people have focused a lot on production, certification, so helping producers certify themselves in good practices, but now they've actually even come up with a sustainable production practice or label that they're actually going to start to use, and very much on health, the good health of obviously all of the animals. They are the licensing body and so on, and they're very supportive, but it's not supportive in the same way as AHDB in terms of foreign trade. That would be usually done much better by an OPORMEX type organization. So that's a pretty important thing. And the one thing that I do want to say about the general trade is that you have to remember that Mexico is actually a huge agricultural producer in many other goods. Over $47 billion in 2022 of goods were shipped from Mexico to other countries, mainly to the US, as you can imagine, with beers, tequilas, obviously being a significant part of that, but not just that. I mean, if you think about avocados, tomatoes, we're the second largest producer of tomatoes and exporter of tomatoes. So Mexico has not just a huge trade, but it's a very positive trade. Probably one of the few places where we're negative is pork production. So in general, Mexico is a huge producer and it has done quite well. So in summary, huge country, great opportunities. I'm gonna actually go back to that because I think it is worthwhile coming back to these slides, 2 slides. Again, the consumption, 2.5 million tons. I mean, that's just a huge amount. 130 million consumers, good growth of the middle class. It's actually been growing about 2% on average per year over the last 15 years, the economy. So you can actually get a sense for what that has meant of how many people are actually coming into the middle class. And then if you, again, consider just that 1.5 million tons are produced, the gap is there, and the gap is actually increasing year over year, just because even though the largest producers are growing, they're not able to grow production in a sustainable manner compared to the increase in the demand based on demand growing at, like, again, population growing at close to 1%, and then middle class growing at about 2%. So again, significant opportunities. It's just about getting the right marketing, going to the right people, understanding how you can position the different production methods that you have here. And I think that there is a really good opportunity. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed some of the pictures. I probably ran through that a little faster than I expected, but I'm quite open to taking any Q&A that you might have.
Thanks very much, Gonzalo. As always, absolutely fascinated to hear the numbers and the scale of pig operations in different parts of the world. And that's one of the things that, when we started this idea of the International Pig Club, that's what we wanted to see. And it's quite interesting how the similarities we're seeing, certainly when we saw the China webinar regards the growth of the middle class, directing, you know, how taking the people away from the farms and the countryside and moving them into urban areas, but also that massive change in consumption and the need for better meats, etc., sort of thing, like, you know. So a couple of questions. We've got one or two already in the chat. You know, you showed the markets and the production was aiming for the heavier pig between 120 and 130 kilos. Do you control the P2, or is that a significant thing to look at all, sort of thing, or what do they do?
So that's a great question. Cover fat is a topic, but not quite as a negative topic, because you have to remember that production with heavier gilts and heavier barrows, again, castrated pigs, would have been usually much greasier in general. And that cover fat is actually a good concept, particularly for export markets in Asia, in terms of the bacon and how they appreciate bacon there. Now, having said that, they have been looking at making a little bit better marbling and leaner meats, and that's where some of these concepts, like going to an Improvac-based production system that keeps the boar as an entire boar for a significant longer period of time, has allowed for a little bit of a leaner pig. So that, I would say, yes, it is a concern. You're starting from a very different base, and at the same time, for some markets, you're literally looking for much greater cover fat, but also, again, some of the benefits that come with it is much greater intramuscular fat, which provides better general perceived taste.
Well, what sort of genetics what is the baseline out there? Are we looking at our standard sort of large white lamb race, or what's your meat line? Is it the Duroc? Is it the Hampshire? What's your baseline genetics out there?
Well, with 1.4 million sows in production, you can imagine there's a lot of variation, and given the variation in particularly the variation in the temperatures and what you face, there's significant variation in the genetics. PIC, I would say, is the largest producer, if I remember correctly, in terms of the largest genetics supplier by a significant margin. And Duroc is the most prevalent in terms of the lines. Having said that, some of the really big producers like Smithfields have their own genetics. I don't remember the naming convention, but they have their own genetics and naming convention. And Smithfields is very specific about what they like based on their production parameters, as I said. And I would say the second largest system, which is the one that's actually in Yucatan and concentrates most of the production in the Yucatan Peninsula, is a single producer. It's it was 86,000 sows when I was there. It's probably around 90,000 now. They have a very specific genetic, again, due to the conditions that they're facing, but also due to the fact that they export massive amounts. I mean, a significant amount of what is exported to China is coming from that. And again, the conditions that they're looking for from those pigs are very specific.
I think it'd be absolutely fascinating. I'll probably pick up this after the webinar regards that genetic differences for the different temperature areas. I think that's a real fascinating area that might be worth a little bit more exploring. You mentioned there's the growing change in integrators and producers getting bigger and bigger. You know, you talk about the 50,000, you're getting 2 or 3 producers now touching the 80, 100,000 cell mark now. Is that area just going to keep growing, do you think, in Mexico?
Yes, and I say unfortunately for the smaller producers, I really don't see how you get anything but they're really large and they're relatively small. It's just tough to compete with the really large ones. And when they're fully integrated as they are, and you start to see that here, obviously, with obviously the BQPs and the Caros and Cranswicks of the world, that having that access to defining what exactly do you need from the meat consumption side, I mean, access to the consumers and all of that just adds a whole level of value to them. So it just makes the whole value chain more manageable. They can balance out the pieces when one is facing a little bit more pressure than the other in a better way. And they've just become so large that the economies of scale make competing really hard. So, I mean, I did say it in my slide, but out of all of the growth that Mexico has had in the pig pork production segment, I think something like last time I looked, 85% of it had come from about 10 to 20 producers. So that's pretty much it. And if you think about the fact that, again, that we are, while those guys are growing at 4%, and I'll go back to one of these slides and that'll give you a little bit more context. So if I look at the states, so where you've got the really large producers, which are Jalisco, Sonora, Yucatan, and I mean, that's pretty much it. Those are the super large ones, right? I mean, and if you look at the growth percentages that you've got for them, you've got Yucatan with that 0.6. You've got Jalisco, which is the largest producer with one of the largest producers, 2.4, and Veracruz 1.5. So again, they're just eating everyone's lunch. Whereas you've got some of the smaller producers, minus, let me say, 2.4. Guanajuato, much more fragmented market, minus 1.4. So that really basically tells you what's happening in the market, you know.
What, if any, what are the limitations for the expansion ahead? Because you showed that massive disparity between consumption and production. What's the limitations within Mexico, do you think?
Same as they are here to a certain extent, labor and permits. They just, I mean, don't get me wrong, getting these beautiful farms in the middle of the forest, the rainforest, is fantastic. I mean, health-wise, it just really helps you. But obviously, the huge issue with that is that you then have those farms there, and the locals don't love our pig farms, right? And when you've got farms that are, I don't know, maybe a couple thousand, actually, I think one of them is up to 5,000 or 10,000 pigs per on the whole shed. It's a massive sheds. It's just, I mean, a completely different topic. And when you've got 4 of them lined up one right next to each other, the smell is not the easiest. So, I mean, permits and labor are the 2 biggest limiting factors for growth. For pretty much everyone, but for the large producers in particular.
What's contained in getting a permit for a large pig farm in Mexico? What are the same constraints that we have regards to, you know, other areas and what to do with all the effluent and slurry, etc.? Just give us a brief overview of a permit for Mexico, please.
I mean, I have to be absolutely transparent and say I don't know all of the ins and outs in that sense, but yes, the affluent and the slurry are the really, really big issues. That's where they faced the challenge.
Okay, lovely. Couple more questions coming in now. What's the most, I mean, relating to your different health statuses across the states, across the vast country of Mexico, What's the most common vaccination protocols out there?
That's a great question. I'll come back here. I would say, obviously, PCV is just standard, about 95%. So even the really small production systems, so even the backyard production systems, pretty much use some sort of PCV vaccination protocol. In the north and in the west, it's actually quite common to have that PDB issue, and therefore vaccination for PDB is quite common up here and in the state of Puebla, but not quite as common in actually uncommon openly in Yucatan and Veracruz. SIV, so swine influenza, has become extremely common, and it's one of the biggest products for Zoetis there and for some of our competitors. And again, just the level of concentration, and I'm gonna come back to these. So if you've got 400,000 tons being produced, and let me say, you probably have, out of the 1.4 million sows, you probably have, I don't know, maybe 300,000 or so here in just this one state. So it's, yes, Mexico is huge, but if you've got 300,000 in a relatively concentrated area, and within the state, it's not like they're really spread out. They're actually within a particular region of the state up here. That's where most of those sows are. So that concentration, which is kind of like what happens in the Lincolnshire area here, has led to obviously a greater concentration of disease as well, or issues with diseases. So SIV, PDB, PIRS is also quite prevalent. So all of these areas do PCV, PIRS, SIV, PDB. I mean, just like a pretty significant vaccination protocol. The other topic I would say is that while they are conscious about antimicrobial resistance and have moved much more to injectable antibiotics rather than in feed or in water, they are much more open about really trying to get pigs past the different issues that they will face, because obviously with as aggressive as PIRS and PCV can be, particularly PIRS, with immunosuppression, that just opens the door for a whole bunch of other opportunistic diseases to then take hold and creating a much bigger issue. So I would say antibiotics in Mexico are much more common than they are here, but particularly so with not so much in feed, but actually injectable antibiotics, where you can be much more targeted in the choice of who you're treating.
Okay, a few more questions rolling in now. Where is Mexico in the terms of net zero production and processing?
It's a great question. And I know, as I said in this second to last or last slide, that they've really put a lot of focus on that, and they've actually come out with a formal certification and a program. So when the particularly large producers saw that there was an impact, as everyone here does, of the perception of consumers on sustainability, they've started to move much more to discussing and finding ways to deal with that. And again, one of the topics is by keeping males entire or as boars for a particularly longer period of time, that has actually impacted positively the feed conversion and therefore the total level of waste production and that is carried out. So that's where they're really looking at that, and individual producers, particularly again that top 5, I would say, are quite focused on starting to really take actions on it. Methane sequestration where possible, obviously, as I said, keeping boars entire as long as they can, just a whole bunch of actions around that. I know soy is obviously a big topic, a big ticket item here. It hasn't quite, I mean, from my conversation with my friends there, it hasn't quite gone to where it is here, but definitely it is one of those topics that people are looking at. The fact that we do have greater access to general grain, just because Mexico is a pretty significant grain producer, but more importantly, because we've got access to pretty much ground transportation from the US, which is one of the biggest feed mills in the world, has meant that feed is coming from a much better source, and therefore usually tends to have a better balance in that sense.
So 2 questions absolutely related to what you've just said. I think you've almost covered it, but Mexico fairly self-sufficient in growing their own feed for the pig industry?
No, absolutely not. They import significant amounts from the US. So we are a pretty big producer of grains, but not all of the grains that we produce are meant for. So our relationship with, let me rephrase that. Our relationship with the US has become such, and the integration with the US in particular, with Canada as well, but with the US in particular, has become such that each of us has kind of become expert at growing certain types of things, right? Fruits and vegetables are usually more commonly grown in Mexico than in the US, just because of, again, weather, and because they are much tougher plants to basically harvest, because they require much more hand picking, if you will, and therefore cheaper labor. But some of the grains are actually much easier to harvest in the US, where you've got these massive, obviously, Great Plains, which allow themselves or lend themselves for very cheap grain. Higher quality grains are sometimes produced in Mexico, or are not sometimes, are produced in Mexico, and we do get access to some of them, but it's just the price point at which the Americans can produce some of these things. It's just, you don't compete. You just don't.
Yeah. And just going back to the net zero question, and you mentioned one of the organizations on the slide. What is the name of the certification program on net zero in Mexico? Is it something you've developed, or is it something that is commonly known around the world?
They just came out with that late last year or early this year. It was done in conjunction with an international organization. I'm trying to remember the name. It is very much focused around packaging for Mexico. And it's basically, and just reading it out from what I see from the slide, so it's just certification for sustainable pork production. That's basically, and that's what they're trying to provide. And again, even though, again, we export, it's not really for the export market. It was much more for the local high-end market that certification came to be.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Just a couple more before we wrap up. The PRRS levels, certainly in the southern states, how you said you have one that's totally PRRS negative and one that's a little bit in between. How protective are them states of their health status, and is there any extra measures that they take to protect that, i.e. pigs from other regions or anything like that sort of thing?
That's a great question, and that is literally I guess in the question you were pretty much giving the answer. So let me see if I can use the pointer here. Yes, there's actually a pen. So let me go here. Oh, come on. So what I wanted to draw here, actually, I'm gonna have to move you. I have you here for me. Here we go. So what they usually do is they actually have literally a biohealth checkpoints here, so that pigs from other regions don't come in. And these guys down here theoretically have it, but they don't tend to be quite as stringent on their checks as I know the guys up here are. And it's quite easy because, I mean, there's only basically 2 highways that are coming from here to here. So it's actually a much easier check. I mean, there's also rural roads, but they would be not preferred. I mean, they're too small for most transport. So therefore, if they can control those 2 highways, they're pretty much there. And therefore, what they've done is they've, for all intents and purposes, created control where they can ensure that they're going to be their health status is going to be safe, and they're not importing. And if you consider that they have their own genetics locally produced and all of that, they're PIC genetics, but they've got a PIC farm internally that they look after and all of that. What that means is that they really don't need anything. They export, but they don't import anything.
So is that state controlled or government controlled?
So with acceptance from the federal government, but it is state controlled. And you can, I mean, and I'll add one more, and privately funded, pretty much. As in, it's in the best interest of the farmers here to make sure that that happens. So they actually pay a special, I don't want to call it a levy, but they pay to a certain extent or give a certain amount of money to the local governments to make sure that they keep a pretty close eye on these borders.
Lovely. Well, I think we're about done for questions, Gonzalo. Thank you very much for an absolute brilliant presentation. As always, it's absolutely fascinating to hear from other parts of the world, sort of thing, like, you know, and your explanations and your answers to questions have been absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for doing that for us. So it just leaves me just to wrap up this webinar a little bit. We have our next international webinar. We are planning to come from Germany in January. So you mentioned Germany in one of your slides as one of the biggest producers in the world. We know Germany's been having a few environmental stroke other issues, so it'd be great to catch up on what that industry is doing. So there'll be plenty of details on that over the next coming months, etc. Please can I ask you to fill the feedback forms in, please, as well, whilst you're on the line as well. And then just also as a little bit of a promotional push for HDB, we're also currently launched the stock person training schemes, which are now live now. We also have now, quite excitingly, we've got the new stock person plus schemes that started as well, after a bit of a stay of execution for the last 3 or 4 years. So thank you very much for attending this webinar, and hope to see you all again in the next one in January. Thank you.
Thank you.